It's great to be here again. I want to just say thank you for inviting me to speak to you about Vaughan Williams. So then, according to his widow, Ursula, he absolutely detested it when people called him Ralph. So I'm going to make sure I refer to him as Rafe this evening. Definitely Rafe and not Ralph. And I suppose it's one thing I really share in common with Rafe is that nobody can pronounce my name either, although Father Mitchell did a very good job earlier. And it's fitting that we should be here in St. Olave's, or is it St. Olave's? And no one can pronounce where we are either, so we're all lost in confusion. Anyway, I come to you this evening with various hats on. I like to wear the composer's hat, the conductor's hat, as an Englishman, and a somewhat rural one at that, as a teacher, and perhaps a sort of fanatical music enthusiast. My long-suffering wife and superior half would probably describe my listening habits as a sort of militant trawling with all the instincts of a stamp collector and a train spotter rolled into one sort of apocalyptic DJ. And the more I listen to Vaughan Williams, the more perplexed I am by him and his music. The more I listen to him and read his diaries, the more strange his legacy seems. And I want to warp some of your impressions of him this evening, but I also want to show you some of the furniture of his mind, perhaps demonstrate some of the building blocks of his craft. So, before we get technical and subjective about interpreting things, let's have a little bit of context. The whole reason for this lecture taking place at all is that last year was the 150th anniversary of his birth in 1872. Indeed, one of the biggest clues about why Vaughan Williams would go on to write the music that he did and what motivated him to earn the reputation that he has, that can be discovered by looking at the time of his youth in England in the 1870s. So just before Vaughan Williams was born, there was a German musicologist called Karl Engel, which I realize now is Charlie's Angels. Karl Engel, yes, who was writing a book about musical identities in Europe, national identities. And his diagnosis of music in England was a pretty bleak one. England would get the tagline, Das Land ohne Musik, the land without music. And to a certain extent, he was right, if we're brutally honest. I mean, if I offered you 2 tickets right now to hear a 19th century concert of Sterndale Bennett, William Crotch, and John Stainer, no, you don't fancy it really, do you? Yes, but if I said, how about we go and hear some Beethoven, Bizet, Bellini, Brahms, Bruckner, Berlioz, Borodin, you see the problem. We haven't even got to the 3rd letter of the alphabet, and the mainland Europeans have got the English beat. Das Land ohne Musik isn't quite right, however. There was a popular tradition called music hall, and a lot of people attended this thing called music hall. Vaughan Williams would eventually reflect on this musical background in England for the ordinary citizen. Now remember, there's no wireless radio in the 1870s, there's no vinyl records yet. So he wrote this in his diary: "There are thousands of men and women whose only musical nourishment has been the banality and vulgarity of the music hall. It never occurred to them to listen to so-called classical music, or if they did, it was with a prejudiced view, determined that they would not enjoy it." As I say, we don't have musical recordings from the 1870s, but we do have later recordings of people who were famous and working in the 1870s. So I want to play you a little music hall song now called I Dunno Where We Are, to give you a sense of what Vaughan Williams saw as the musical majority of popular music in his youth.
When I sees the way to reach old pals, I am filled with nothing but disgust. He says as we isn't close enough. He says we ain't upon a par with him just because he's better off. Won't smoke a pipe, mistake on a cigar. When he's up at Covent Garden, you can see him a-standing all alone. Wound joining a quiet Tommy Dodd, drinking scotch and sodas on his own. He has the cheek and impudence to call his mother his ma. Since Jack Jones come into a little bit of splosh, I don't know where he are.
You don't know where he are, by Gus Ellen there. You might spot that little bit of the tune of 10 green bottles hanging on the walls, or drinking song. So Vaughan Williams was not a fan of that. So what did little Rafe actually enjoy? Well, as a boy, he liked Handel. Now remember that Handel was not British. And let me read you a little anecdote from Vaughan Williams's youth. When I was a small boy, I was brought up almost entirely on Handel. I once heard a Bach gavotte at a village concert and asked my auntie whether it was right to put such a name on the same program as the great masters. And she said to me, "But dear, Bach is quite a good composer, but of course not so good as Handel." When he first heard Wagner as a student later on, he said he loved it so much it was like meeting an old friend. And he admitted to stealing vast swathes of Beethoven and Haydn in his own work. And I say stealing, and he called it cribbing, which I suppose makes it okay then, does it? His first musical fingerprints were German, and he would call them his Teutonic influences. Now, to illustrate this point, let's listen to the first minute of an early work for piano duet, a prelude written by Vaughan Williams in 1893 when he was 21 years old. So to my ears, that is the sound of the German Baroque, and that's the music that Vaughan Williams loved and experienced the most in his youth. So it's not surprising that he would basically emulate that. You know, another of his Teutonic influences is that of Mendelssohn and his revival of Bach's music, which had a profound influence across Britain at the time, right up to the royal family and Queen Victoria herself. In the realm of opera, almost everything of quality was imported from Italy, and whatever homegrown talent they had would put on fake Italian names and mannerisms to buttress their credibility. The French ballet reigned supreme, with Britain basically riding on the tailcoats of Shakespeare, who had been dead for going on 300 years. There was definitely a chip on the British musical shoulder. Even when Vaughan Williams gets to the new Royal College of Music and Trinity College in Cambridge, he is still acutely aware that the great teachers of Stanford, Elgar, and Parry had themselves studied in Leipzig and Stuttgart. The artistic debts to the likes of Brahms and Reinecke were obvious not only in the sound of the music, but in the dedications which appear at the top of their scores. Many of his famous contemporaries were themselves opting to study in Frankfurt. Percy Grainger, Roger Quilter, Balfour Gardner, to name but a few, all studied in Frankfurt. And eventually, Vaughan Williams, too, goes to study with Max Bruch and Herzogenberg in Berlin in 1897. And here's what Vaughan Williams writes about this uncomfortable debt. He says this: Shakespeare and Milton enriched our language with cullings from France, Italy, Scandinavia, and Greece. Our music also can be enriched from foreign models, but it must not be swamped by them. We have been too apt to think that though we could beat the foreigner at business and sport, the foreigner must necessarily beat us in questions of art. So then, Vaughan Williams graduates from Cambridge and London with a great deal of frustration. In his diary, after his very first public performance in Cambridge, he writes this: "In my male voice quartet, the second tenor got a bar out and remained so till the end. The audience disliked it." He writes of the response he got from Stanford after showing him his final work portfolio: "Damnably ugly, my boy. Why do you write such things?" "Because I like them, sir." "But you can't like them. They're not music. It's all rot, my boy." So the first decade of the 20th century was a turning point for our composer, because three life-changing things were about to happen to him. Each one of these three things was absolutely crucial, I think, in informing the repertoire that we love today, over 100 years later. The first thing that happened was he needed to get a job. And so straight out of university, you can imagine a vaguely discontented fellow from Gloucestershire, everybody calling him Ralph, and him getting sort of annoyed. And anyway, his dad was a vicar and persuaded him, quite against his will, to become an organist. Oh. And he studied with the master of the Queen's music, Sir Walter Parrott, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. He didn't like it. And in his diary he writes he hated the smug solemnity of these mid-Victorians. He said, poor Samuel Sebastian Wesley was just tied to that organ stool. He found it all incredibly restrictive. That said, it paid his bills, and he took up the role of director of music at St. Barnabas in Lambeth, South London. And I'm quite glad he did, because it changed his life. This is where singing and choral music would focus his mind and start to open the floodgates of his creativity. He writes this of the human voice: when the artist writes for choir, it is hardly possible to be untrue to oneself. It is the most primitive and at the same time the most modern, because it is the most intimate form of human expression. It is connected with our earliest associations and inevitably turns our thoughts back to our real selves, to that sincerity of purpose which it is so difficult to follow. I believe this is especially the case in choral music. So let's listen to an early choral piece by Vaughan Williams now from 1896, and it's called Echo's Lament for Narcissus. This is the sound of the High German Romantic period, but with English words. It has all the fingerprints of Reinberger, Brahms, Bruch, and Mendelssohn. Now, a more technical question might be, what makes that sound German and not English? And I shouldn't generalize, but what the hell, I'm going to do it anyway. The easiest nationality to spot is Italian, because Italian romantic music is usually based on a melody. You have a tune, can be quite florid and soaring, relatively simple accompaniment with relatively predictable harmony, and they tend to love virtuosos. And we distinguish French music from Italian by looking at ornaments and color. It can be frillier, but French music is fundamentally different because the harmony is different. French harmony is employed not as a strict formula, but with chords juxtaposed for their interesting colors, and indeed more interesting colors of orchestration. But German romantic music is identified by rules and functions. That's why their trains run on time. The harmony obeys rules, and the dissonant chords, they resolve in a strict way, which you heard in that extract. The melodies are less elaborate than the Italians and less ornamented than the French. And there are more counter melodies built within the texture, and this is called counterpoint. So here in Vaughan Williams' piece, we can say it sounds German because of the way the harmony is behaving, the way the counterpoint is working, the absence of ornaments or frills, and perhaps even the lack of any melody. And it was around this time that Vaughan Williams started leading performances of Bach's Passions and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. He was really into it. And I think it must have been quite interesting to see him lead a choir in these towering Germanic works. Here's what he had to say about the Ode to Joy. One could almost wish that Beethoven, while writing his voice parts, had at his elbow a practical, uninspired, competent Anglican choir master who would point out that the awkward tessitura is either too high or too low frequently, and there is no necessity in those difficult high quavers in the soloists to make a noise like a dog being run over by a motor car. I made the experiment of modifying the voice parts in a few places so that those under the rank of archangel could take part. I kind of love his cockiness here. I wish I could hear how it panned out in real life, the sort of ironed version, Anglican version of Beethoven 9. Now, the life-changing part of his work as a church musician really came in 1904, when a priest in his mid-30s named Percy Dearmer called upon Vaughan Williams, who was himself 32 years old, to collate some hymns for a new hymn book. I don't know about you, but when I think of the New English Hymnal, this green book, little green book, I think of a sort of wizened gravitas and revered experience. I don't think of the scheme of two guys in their 30s, but that's by the by. Vaughan Williams was essentially tricked into being the musical editor of this quite radical book. He was tricked because Dearmer told him that he would just need to put some tunes together and it will only take you about 2 months. When in reality, it would take Vaughan Williams 2 years to design this first truly great achievement. And here's what he said at the time. Those 2 years closely associating with the best and the worst tunes in the world was a better musical education than any amount of sonatas and fugues. And so we start to get music like Come Down, O Love Divine, to the tune Down Ampney, not being the command to a dog named Ampney, but rather it's named after his place of birth. And we get music like the tune Sine Nomine, which you'll recognize in sounding like this. Side note, the English hymnal was quite radical and briefly banned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It cut out verses which seemed to articulate class divides and cut out some of what Vaughan Williams called the disfiguring miasmas of languishing sentimentality. They cut verses like this one from All Things Bright and Beautiful. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. Ooh, that doesn't age well, does it? That one. The politics of arguing about hymn books stays with us today. Now we're editing things like gendered language. And it's comforting to see that some things never change, and we still keep arguing about it. Anyway, it's around the turn of the 20th century that Vaughan Williams starts to shed his so-called Teutonic influences, and you can really start to hear it. So the first life-changing event is becoming a church musician and publishing the English hymnal. I say life-changing, it's a really big step to becoming an extraordinary composer rather than one of the many good ones around at the time. The hymn book was a catalyst in two important ways. It inspired Vaughan Williams towards two great pursuits that would occupy the rest of his career: the intense study of British folk song and the early music revival. The new hymn book sought to consolidate the over 100 different hymn books in use and to select what he felt were the best tunes. And he was captivated by folk melodies and started to go down the rabbit hole. And he collected hundreds of tunes. It was only going to take you 2 months. No, 2 years of collecting hundreds of tunes with Cecil Sharp around 1903. And here's what he had to say about this journey of discovery and collecting. We must build up on the basis of folk tunes a corpus of compositions arising out of our own country and character, and we will proceed to pour out rhapsodies and overtures to show the world that we are no longer a land without music. I am telling you not of something clownish and boorish, not of the half-forgotten reminiscences of toothless old people, not of archaic museum pieces, but of an art which grows straight out of the needs of a people, an art which is indigenous and owes nothing to anything outside itself, and above all, an art which to us today has something to say. It has behind it the accumulated emotion of the many successive generations who have themselves recreated afresh the old majesty and loveliness. Now, his work notating these folk songs, like the one we sang at Evensong tonight, King's Fold, I heard the voice of Jesus say, and he changed these secular tunes into hymns, and he gave us a tremendous legacy. And this legacy has certainly reached more people around the world than his 5 operas or 9 symphonies. Just think, Vaughan Williams went to visit Mr. Garman in Surrey in 1903 and asked him to sing a song. And Vaughan Williams took down the tune Forest Green, which now we all know as the melody for O Little Town of Bethlehem. Or imagine the rooms of poor Mrs. Kemp in Essex in 1904, who gave him the melody of Monk's Gate, which we now know as He Who Would Valiant Be, or To Be a Pilgrim. Now, Vaughan Williams' own fingerprints start to come into focus. Through his immersion in folk song and plain song, he becomes a disciple of modal music. Now, what is modal music? Well, your ordinary classical or even romantic scale, which the Germans were using, sounds like this. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Those set of pitches. But modal music has different ratios of gaps between the notes and is much more historic in folk songs and in the church and can sound like this. Ya da 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 ya da 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 da. Or it could sound like this. Ya da 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 da. Now these modes have fancy technical names like Dorian and Phrygian, but the point is They would become the hallmarks of Vaughan Williams' most popular works. Let's have a listen to one of his early orchestral works, which really shows his embracing of modes and turning away from the German Romantic style. This is the Norfolk Rhapsody of 1905. Imagine a German writing that. You can't imagine it. That's very English now. That flattened seventh note of the scale now is just screaming out Vaughan Williams. He really wanted to bring that flat seven back, and boy, did he do it a lot. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's what he really liked. The first phrase the choir sang this evening in the Magnificat had a whacking great big flat seven in it. And all of magnified, that flat seven, and he just loved it. Anyway, editing the hymn book was the first big step. The second step was embracing the local folk songs of Britain. And the third life-changing thing that I think had a tremendous influence on Vaughan Williams was the early music revival. The early music revival was really the thing that separated Vaughan Williams from the likes of Parry and Elgar and Stanford. That older generation of composers was popular, but it was stuck. It had reached something of a dead end in the rehashing of Brahms and Wagner, the pompous imperial marches, the hysterical arrangements of Bach. If you want to hear decadent music, and music that's sort of curdling, I encourage you to check out Elgar's orchestral arrangements of Bach, but that's for another time. In the face of all this epic expression comes the scholarly pursuits of Edmund Fellows and Richard Runciman Terry. Fellows was a musician and a priest based at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, and Terry was the new director of music at the Catholic Westminster Cathedral. These two men were responsible for creating modern performing editions of 16th and 17th century music by composers like Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, and Orlando Gibbons. Now, their music had seldom been performed since the Reformation, and the decline of church music had led to a generational lapse in musical literacy. There were very few musicians who could even read the old part books, and fewer still who would think it worth performing and championing. So, inspired by Fellows and Terry, Vaughan Williams was deeply affected by this music and would have been delighted by the rare opportunity to hear Nannino's anthem sung by the choir this evening. Here's what he said about this revival. Those who bring about revivals are often scoffed at by the ignorant as foisting on the people something unnatural. But does not life itself start for us in 9 cases out of 10 artificially? Ask any doctor. I can think of no piece of music, with the possible exception of Palestrina's Missa Brevis, which can be said to be absolutely without flaw. This music deals with something essential, not with the tricks of presentation. Now, when we combine modal melodic writing, the serene and spicy characteristics of the harmonic devices of the 16th century, with the large, romantic, expressive compass of a string orchestra, we wind up with something like this. one is never quite sure if one is listening to something very old or very new, wrote one reviewer of the now immortal Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis there, composed in 1910. What a transformation. One of the things that makes early music like Tallis or Bird sound so beguiling to our modern ears is something called false relation. And no, it's not to do with having an awkward brother. It occurs when notes sound like they contradict one another, simultaneously sounding major and minor thirds at the same time, or juxtaposing two chords which are not in the same key, but have an interesting color when they are sounded in quick succession. And early music is full of these devices, and a close study of Vaughan Williams finds them absolutely everywhere. The stage was now set for many of his most famous works to be written. He had the formative experiences with English hymns, the encyclopedic knowledge of its folk songs, and now with its Renaissance music. And it's around this time that we hear of his sort of artistic manifesto in lectures that he gave. And he said this: any student can recreate Wagner, Debussy, and Sibelius. We must, in spirit, though not in form, start again from the beginning, even at the risk of appearing parochial. It is a spiritual necessity. It is the expression of the soul of a nation. If we have no musical soul of our own, how can we appreciate the musical souls of others? Let the tree develop flowers undreamt of into all unknown directions, but if you pull it up by its roots, it will die. His music had indeed been transformed, and you can hear that spirit of starting again. But then again, he was developing new debts altogether. Here's another account of his from the time. In 1908, I came to the conclusion that I was lumpy and stodgy and had come to a dead end, and that a little French polish might be of use to me. I sought lessons from Maurice Ravel, whose motto to me was to make music complexe mais pas compliqué, complex but not complicated. He taught me the heavy Teutonic manner was not necessary. Was this just a little French polish? I'll let you be the judge now, and I'll play extracts from 3 pieces by Ravel and 3 pieces by Vaughan Williams mixed up, and the game is that you have to tell me which one is which. You can give me your answers afterwards if you fancy. So, soul of a nation, or is it just an illusion of Englishness? And you ask anyone in the world to listen to the lark ascending, and they'll probably tell you it sounds English, like an English field. But could it ever have existed without his Teutonic influences? Could it ever have found its voice without that French polish? I think there's something quite wonderful about knowing that Ravel and Vaughan Williams would both drive ambulances during World War I. It's nice to know that composers can be useful from time to time. I'm reaching the end of my remarks, and it pains me to have neglected the tremendous influence of Gustav Holst on Vaughan Williams. These two men, they shared every piece they wrote with each other for over 40 years. It's kind of extraordinary, everything they wrote. A number of times you hear echoes of Thaxted and the planets reflected through Vaughan Williams' symphonies is uncanny, and the same is true in the opposite direction. There would be no Holst Moorside Suite without the Vaughan Williams Norfolk Rhapsody, and there would be no Holst Psalm 148 without Vaughan Williams' hymn book. In fact, there's a tremendous amount of music that would not exist without Vaughan Williams' inspiring legacy. There would certainly be no Herbert Howells without him. And even after Benjamin Britten said that Vaughan Williams' music, quote, repulses me as appallingly dull. I haven't been so bored for ages. Britten still managed to lift entire chunks of the elder composer's symphonic scherzos and put them into his war requiem. And I've been enjoying examining the various degrees of hypocrisy in these various composers. For example, Vaughan Williams was appalled by European imitators of American jazz. But there are whole passages of his Sixth Symphony which are a kind of awkwardly forced swing with a tenor saxophone just sort of plonked in. He found the whole tone scale a tacky and hateful device, but his C Symphony is just overflowing with its use. He said Mahler was a tolerable imitation of a composer, but he lifted vast chunks and gestures of Mahler's Ninth Symphony into his own London Symphony. And what was that Matthew said about tending to the log in your own eye before the speck in someone else's? Anyway, now just in case you thought that every English person loves Vaughan Williams, I hate to break it to you, but they don't. The composer Peter Warlock said of his Third Symphony, it was all just a little too much like looking at a cow looking over a gate. And Aaron Copland said of his Fifth Symphony, it was like staring at a cow for 45 minutes. And ultimately, Elizabeth Lutyens deals the killer blow by saying his work was quite simply cowpat music. But my favorite bit of slagging off Vaughan Williams comes from the famous conductor Sir Thomas Beecham, who was said to have been conducting a rehearsal of Vaughan Williams' Sixth Symphony, and after the last movement, the music had stopped, and he just kept conducting sort of listlessly like this. And after a while, he leans over to the first violin and says, "Why aren't you playing?" And the violinist says, "Well, Sir Thomas, it's finished, Sir Thomas." He then looks down at the violinist and says, "So it is. Thank God for that." Let us take 2 minutes now to listen to some of these clips from his many modernist works. And can you really call them cowpat music? by the 1940s and 1950s, we know that he was thinking just as much about the ruins of Hiroshima as he was about ascending larks. And despite the shallow charges of being a cowpat monger, he taught hundreds of students at the Royal College of Music in London for decades and played a huge role in turning England's musical reputation from being das Land ohne Musik to one of character, distinguishable features rooted in its own history, and all this recognizable over 150 years after his birth. His music grew such distinctly English characteristics that it was even banned in World War II Germany under the label of anti-Nazi propaganda. Pieces without words. Anti-Nazi propaganda. I, for one, am very grateful indeed for his extraordinary legacy, which is resounding through this diocese to this very day, and I hope for many years to come. But the last word should go to the man himself, so I leave you with this reflection on his work. I feel content to provide good plain cooking and hope that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. There is no need to justify music. It is its own justification. This is not only a form of enjoyment, it is also a spiritual exercise in which all have their part. There is nothing in itself that is common or unclean, and there are no canons of art except contained in the well-worn tag, "To thine own self be true." Thank you. Yes, of course, yes.
Thank you, Rob. That was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think you are taking questions if there are any, and if you have a question, I'm going to come to you with the mic because we're live streaming. So, yes, sir.
Can you think of any reason why Hugh the Drover doesn't get performed, recorded? There is a recording, but
good question.
Quite old.
Yes, I had to listen through some of Vaughan Williams' operas on. They're online. You can find them. There are 5 of them. Yes, the best one, in my opinion, is Riders to the Sea. Hugh the Drover is it's a huge work. I think there's something unfashionable about these operas. I must say I'm not an expert in his operas, but what is unfashionable about them is a good question. That there's something of the edginess of Benjamin Britten that's overshadowed it somewhat. And when he talks of himself being stodgy and lumpy, that's the question, is sometimes he gets the balance exactly right. I think in some of those modernist pieces, it's really striking. But I think in a lot of his operas, you get this idea that you're just being sort of, not yelled at, but this modal music is just going on and on and on, going round and round. There are some tremendous laments. I think, yes, Riders to the Sea is the one I would love to see at the COC. But I don't know Hugh the Drover as well. So you've heard it? So John in Love was done by the COC. Good on there, good on there. Well, I must say, I'm quite new to the city. I moved here in 2014. So learning about what operas have been performed here, I'm very interested to know. Yeah, so John in Love is another one. Anyway, thank you I'm sorry I can't answer more thoroughly than that.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
Do you see a cultural comparison between Vaughan Williams and his contemporaries, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who said that they wrote to give England some folklore which it didn't have?
Well, I think Vaughan Williams went out to try and explore what the folk melodies were and to go and collect them, which I can see with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They were, as you say, creating ones that they thought they didn't have. But I think Vaughan Williams believed that there was a great wealth of old music, old tunes, old stories, old dances, and he had that same urge to kind of collect and create an English identity. But yes, they are around the same time, aren't they? Yeah, other than wearing lots of tweed, I wonder how much more they had in common. It's a good question. I mean, it's no coincidence that when you hear or watch the Lord of the Rings movies, it's filled with music that sounds like Vaughan Williams, using exactly the same devices. I think they wanted to draw that attachment to something very modern and very old. And he has that particular magic that I think is also, you can feel in the Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, something very old and something that was to them very modern at the same time. Yeah. It's an interesting parallel, yeah.
Other questions? It's two.
Thank you. I wonder, either from what you've read in the diaries or just from your analysis of the music, Wagner being such an important early influence, I wonder what he thought of his German contemporaries, Vaughan Williams' German contemporaries in this post-Wagnerian school. Did he like Strauss and early Schoenberg?
Yes, he was certainly a Germanophile. He really loved it. What's interesting, towards German culture as a whole, he was very, very generous. In fact, throughout World War II, he was too old to fight, but he was the head of all of the prisoner of war refugee housing in his area, and he was spent a lot of energy in sort of being kind to Germans, and he when in a time when it was not fashionable to do so. I wonder about Schoenberg. It's a good question. He has dalliances, doesn't he, with modernity? It's like he dips his toes in the Fourth Symphony, and then he says, "Oh no, the Fifth Symphony, I'm just going to come out again." What was he listening to? I think Strauss is more famous. I think travelled well in England. Vaughan Williams himself, he travelled in World War I, but this wasn't to listen to music. I'm not sure how much Schoenberg's music did travel in the early part of the teens and the 20s, and what performances there were really bad, so not accurate. And the conductors were just saying, "I don't know what to do," and other fights would break out. So our idea of like a unified German front of music is something of a construction. But I think he was a massive Germanophile, yeah. He was that paradox of owing everything to Germany culturally and then trying to find his own identity at the same time. Yeah, so as I said in that quotation where we have to find our own, we have to not be swamped by the Germans, but he's also has a great debt to them. Yeah. Sorry if that doesn't answer your question.
I was really amused and intrigued at the number of great composers who enjoy slagging each other. And I was wondering if there was any kind of a relationship, either positive or negative, between Vaughan Williams and Elgar. And also, you yourself are actually quite a fine composer, I know, because I actually commissioned a mass from you. And I'm wondering if there's anyone around that you'd like to slag off today.
Okay. Well, Vaughan Williams did really love Elgar. He tried to get lessons from him, and Elgar wouldn't write back. Actually, Elgar's wife wrote back and said, "Sir Edward is too busy to deal with you," which I don't think caused Vaughan Williams a big heartache. I think he got to study with Ravel, which is pretty awesome, and in Germany. That was so Elgar. Yes, Elgar's debts are extremely German. I mean, he doesn't embrace folk song in quite the same way. There are many of Elgar's pieces that you could just mistake for a German piece. Although having that, he does have a different kind of English stamp than Vaughan Williams would have. No one can hear Nimrod and say that sounds like a German piece. But there are other movements within the Enigma variations that are very Germanic. Elgar's main, we forget that he was very Catholic and also outside of the Anglican tradition in England as well. It's very interesting to give a history of Elgar one day. Slagging off composers, who do I dislike? I think that music is all about being useful. For example, if you're having dinner and you want some music on, you don't want to hear the Bach Passions played at you at dinner. So I would say in that context, a Bach is not useful. Whereas conversely, if you're going dancing, ballroom dancing, say, and they start playing, let's say you're on Good Friday and they start interpolating the Bach Passions with Strauss waltzes, you'd say, well, that's not useful here. So that's kind of what my view of music. I use it. I use it to feel relaxed or to get some kind of spiritual kick or to help me meditate or to wake me up in the morning. And I can see that some things are not useful in their context. For example, if we're in church and we're here and we're in this particular building, there might be a particular kind of music which is not conducive to what we're trying to do, which is worship God or reflect on Scripture. If music makes you want to go and bust a move on the dance floor, maybe that's not the right thing. So, yes, context and use, yes, I would say, rather than saying good or bad. Although, if you buy me a drink, I'll tell you who I really hate. Yeah.